Okay, thank you, Bill. Good detailed answer from one who's in the middle of it. Tom, thoughts?
Well, I'm not a professional at negotiating these kinds of things, but it does seem to me that ultimately you do need a goal, because if you don't have a goal in terms of concentrations, you don't know how urgent the issue is and how hard to try. So I hope that outside of that process, there will be continuing and growing attention to that. I hope very much that sort of this logjam that has existed between the United States in particular, but the developed nations and some of the major developing ones like China and India and Brazil is overcome. I hope there will be some sensible bilateral negotiations and consultations outside of the actual formal Copenhagen meeting. And certainly, you know, we go into this with one enormous change, which is President-elect Obama, who, in the words of Carol Browner, really gets it. I mean, that is just, you know, hugely important. So it's a lot to do by the end of the year. If Copenhagen doesn't work very well, and maybe they'll need to adjourn, right? Put it off for another 6 months. But I think it's the real moment of truth as to whether the world is really going to take this on properly.
Great. Thanks, Tom. Sara, last word.
I agree with the points that were just made by my two colleagues. I'd like to address something related, but not exactly the same thing. I'd really like to go back to the point that Bo was making in his remarks about the crucial importance of actually engaging the public. Yeah. And I think that climate change has been left so much to climate change experts. I know when I first got into this field, it took me months to even know what the words meant. You know, I'm just the most confused, complicated thing I'd ever heard of before. I'm reading all these articles, these chapters. What the action that's needed on the part of the public is they need to think about how do you live life in a way that's climate friendly. How are we going to address all the other major things that governments are trying to deal with? I mean, there's a lot of, we're having meetings all the time. I'm in the agriculture field. We're having a lot of meetings about the food crisis, and we ain't seen nothing yet, as Bill was saying. We need, and yet you go to some of those, and the only thing they talk about is how can we get more seed and fertilizer, because that's how we dealt with the food crisis back in the 1960s. That's not how we can deal with the food crisis now. We need to be thinking about what's the most climate-friendly way to deal with the food crisis. What's the most climate-friendly way to deal with the energy crisis? What's the most climate-friendly way to deal with rebuilding our cities? And I think that's the part of it. We haven't engaged the public enough with thinking through what it would mean for all the other actions. How do we meet the 2010 biodiversity goal? How do you meet the 2010 biodiversity goal without major action on climate change? And I think until people can make those connections, they're not going to get behind their politicians and tell them, yes, of course, we must and we can, and we'll benefit from doing it.
Great. Thanks, Sara. Sara just made a point that I was going to end with to duplicate something that Tom mentioned, which is that even if negotiators can't take on particular objectives because the negotiation would never succeed, we're free. I don't know how many negotiators we have in this room, but I'm sure not going to be one of them. And we're free to talk about the importance of 350 as a goal or 280 as a goal, talk about that to our representatives in Congress or in parliaments, write letters to the editors of newspapers to say we think maybe a carbon tax makes more sense than cap and trade, and will be simpler if we believe that, and that we're willing to pay one if it's structured properly. Certainly what's needed is massive public support for working with urgency, with a real sense of urgency on this issue. And this is one of the thoughts that I think was behind all of us, Janet, Michael, and myself, in thinking about how to pull together this report, and all 47 authors in writing it, that it is not just a matter of the negotiators. The negotiators are going to feel the heat from the governments, and the governments, as Dr. Lovejoy said, are going to feel the heat from the public, and that's critical for all of us to be engaged in. So we have a few minutes left. Great. So we have time for overall questions inspired by these remarks. I'll start with Alan Miller, and then we'll move back a little bit. Alan?
Okay, my question is in part for you, Bob. And it goes, because it's in part about the communication point. And I was struck even in Dr. Paciori's presentation that he used a slide in which GDP has some business as usual against which we are making some sacrifice. And I just would like the panelists to respond, and perhaps you, Bob, not having had a chance to read the book yet. But I think one very strong message that should come out of this is that there is no more business as usual. And putting up slides in which GDP goes up as if it will be unaffected by climate change is to completely miss the point. And if even Dr. Paciori has a slide like that, I think it goes to the fact that communications are really a fundamental area in need of some rectification here.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure how to take that on except to say that I do agree with you. And I think that past experience shows that GDP is not a straight line. Certainly recent past experience really demonstrates that. And I suspect that Patchy will be revising that slide. I mean, one of the things that disappointed me about that slide was that it didn't make the point that he was obviously making in the next slide, which is that GDP itself is going to be horribly affected by our failure to act on mitigation. I think we have a long way to go in communication. One of the things that struck us in just compiling this book was how it's still, even with the IPCC, and I have nothing but respect for their work, they've been so important as mobilizers of public and journalistic opinion about these areas, but there's still this confusion about what units are we talking about. There's carbon dioxide, there's carbon dioxide equivalent. Are we talking about a 1990 baseline, a 2005 baseline? And it's very hard for the public to follow these things and know these things. And even I have to say, as Worldwatch is a member of the U.S. Climate Action Network, even from the standpoint of the environmental community, the use of acronyms is just so incredibly overwhelming. I started out writing my chapter with the goal, and I talked to Linda Stark about this, I don't want to use any acronyms. I just want to spell everything out so the public can see them all. I didn't win the argument. We had to go to GHGs and some of the major acronyms. But I think that the public is hungry to get better informed about these things. And I think it's important that we not just talk to ourselves, that we not just think of ourselves as kind of a community or a priesthood that really gets climate change, but that we talk at the level of the public and, as Sara was alluding, help the public, which I think very much wants to live in a climate neutral kind of way, to achieve that. But you're getting at the right idea there, Alan. Other comments from the panel?